This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 9, part 3 of my second book, entitled Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Continuing straight on, this is section L, letter L, entitled Globa and Nanotechnology. This section is more speculative and futuristic than the above sections. It's concerned with the impact that the rise of nanotechnology, that is molecular scale engineering, will have on the planet. Before talking about the role a global state will play in creating policies regarding nanotech, we need to give a brief description of what nanotech is. The term nano means a billionth, that is a thousandth of a millionth. A nanometer is a billionth of a meter, that is the scale of molecules. Nanotechnology is the technology at the scale of the nanometer, that is, the technology that manipulates atoms and molecules by building molecular scale machines with atomic precision. So with a well-developed nanotech, it would be possible to build robots the size of molecules that could be programmed to perform a list of seemingly miraculous tasks. For example, ridding the world of disease. These nanorobots, nanots, could be programmed to detect cancer cells and kill them, or to detect harmful viruses and kill them. They could also be programmed to repair aging cells and thus create immortality. I will talk a bit more about this later in this section. They could be programmed to clean out our clogged veins and arteries so that we do not die of heart attacks and strokes. Nanotech could also be used for many other kinds of activities. After all, nanotech is really just the programming of matter to do whatever one wants with it. It's the technology that will be the foundation stone of our 21st century economy. Nanotech could be used to clean up our environment. For example, nanots that eat up oil spills and convert the pollution into harmless molecules that are then released to the atmosphere. Nanots could be used to manufacture anything we want. Nanots could be made that create copies of themselves, so we could quickly have zillions of them to perform many tasks. They could then be designed to perform production lines to manufacture tiny components that are then combined to make larger components, which in turn are combined to make even larger components until they reach useful human-sized products. Alternatively, an embryogenic approach might be used, that is, an approach that would be similar to the way an embryo grows in the womb. Such a nanotech would be based on cells that connect and then switch on and off part of their own DNA-like instructions to grow 3D products using similar methods that are used when babies grow. I label this kind of manufacture embryofacture. With a well-developed nanotech that humanity will probably have within about 20 years, the whole concept of economic scarcity will be changed forever. If nanotech machines can build anything by simply assembling the molecules in the correct way, then the price of manufacture of almost anything becomes very cheap. Nanots could make copies of themselves, so one could have as many nanots as are needed to manufacture some product. With the notion of economic scarcity relegated to history, what would determine the price of a manufactured product? These prices would fall to virtually zero, or perhaps by global government policy would be zero. I suppose there would always be transportation costs of the raw materials from the source sites to the manufacturing sites. Even nanofacture requires raw atoms as input. People could then have as much as they want of anything. Since the amount of space for the near future will be limited, one could not fill up one's living space with too much stuff, that is, possessions. Perhaps the same nanots that manufacture things could also disassemble them. I would not be too surprised if people adapt fairly quickly to a nanotech-based era of true economic affluence. Perhaps initially people would get bored not having to perform traditional work, but people would adapt. There are examples of tribal cultures where they work only about 2 hours a day because food is abundant in their tropical islands. They fill their time with the arts and elaborate display rituals. They are not bored. The prospect of a disease-free world and a nanotech-induced immortality poses much greater political problems. A global state would then have to create laws and customs regarding who lives, who dies, who reproduces, and how many children. Since the will to live is inbred in all of us, disagreements would be strong when the time comes to formulate life policy. Perhaps some of the people who are not given the right to be immortal could migrate to off-world colonies and be made immortal as a reward. Solving these nanotech-based problems will be a major challenge for the global state later this century. Globa will have to come to terms with the rise of nanotechnology and its powerful impact upon humanity. M. Globa and the Artellect. One of the many consequences of the rise of nanotech later this century will be the creation of the Artellect, that is, the godlike, massively intelligent machine. Nanotech will give the neurosciences powerful new tools to investigate how the human brain works. For example, nanots that are programmed to settle at every synapse, that is, a connection between two neurons, that is, two brain cells, in the brain, and then to send a radio report giving its position, its synaptic strength, etc. All this information could then be assembled in a nanotech-based hypercomputer and analysed to understand how the human brain works. This knowledge can then be translated into engineering principles to build artificial brains. Neuroscience and neuroengineering will become a two-way street, strongly influencing each other. The result will be increasingly intelligent machines that I call Artellects. In time, the Artellects will become so intelligent to the point that people across the planet will be asking such questions as, should human beings allow the Artellects to become smarter than we are? Can the rise of intellectual intelligence be stopped? Should it be stopped? What could happen to human beings if the Artellects become hugely more intelligent than we are? Could the Artellects decide humans are an inferior pest and wipe us out? I've written a book on the above issues called The Artellect War, Cosmists versus Terrans, a bitter controversy concerning whether humanity should build godlike, massively intelligent machines. I believe that the question whether humanity should build Artellects or not will be the dominant global political issue of this century. I am pessimistic about the outcome. I'm predicting a major war over the issue late in the 21st century, using late 21st century weapons, resulting in the deaths of billions of people, hence the concept of giga-death. Since I believe it's likely that the planet will have a global government more or less by mid-century, the Artellect issue, or species dominance issue, will be one of, and probably the most important topic that the global government will have to deal with. If the creation of a global government precedes the rise of the Artellect, then we'll probably not see a correlation between a geographical location and a people holding a particular view regarding whether the Artellect should be built or not. That is, either in favour of building them, that is the cosmist viewpoint, or against building them, that is the Terran viewpoint. For example, we would probably not see the Americans being mostly cosmist and the Chinese being mostly Terran. In the past, political views usually correlated with countries. For example, the Nazis were German, the fascists were Italian, etc. In a truly global state, there will be no countries, unless the world state is a federation of nation-states. So any passionate disagreement between the world's citizens then becomes a type of internal disagreement. This leads to the idea of a global civil war, the topic of the next section. N. Global civil war? Question mark. As mentioned in the above section, the species dominance issue, that is whether humanity should build Artellects or not, has all the potential of causing a major war. The cosmists will look upon Artellect building as a form of God building, because the Artellects will be hugely superior to human beings. They will have virtually unlimited memory and will think 1,000,000 times faster than us. They'll be based on 21st century technologies such as 1 bit per atom memory storage, 3-dimensional, heatless, reversible, nanotech, quantum computers. They would be immortal, could go anywhere, change their shape, do anything, and think anything. They could have capacities trillions of times above the human level, and a lot more. To the cosmos, based on the word cosmos, building Artlex will be a form of science-based religion, providing a glorious goal for humanity to serve as a stepping stone to the next higher form of evolution. To the Terrans, based on the word terra, that is the earth, building Artlex implies accepting the risk that in an advanced form the Artlex might decide to wipe out humanity as a pest, or just through utter indifference. The Artlex may become so superior to human beings that they may totally ignore us and kill us as a consequence of some action they take, not thinking about the consequences of their actions towards us. To them, we might be irrelevant, like rocks to humans, for example. To the Terrans, the only way to ensure that humanity does not have to run the risk that the Artlex might wipe us out one day is that the Artlex themselves are never built. But such a conclusion runs utterly counter to what the cosmists want. To the Terrans, killing a few million cosmists would be justified for the sake of preserving the lives of the billions of human beings from extermination at the hands of the Artlex. But the cosmists would be well aware of the philosophy of the Terrans and would prepare themselves. With the late 21st century weaponry and two bitterly opposed sides, we have the makings here of a terrible war. The most depressing aspect of such a war would be the number of casualties. Over the past 2 centuries, the scale of industrialized killing has risen sharply. About 20 million people died in World War I, and 50 to 100 million people died in World War II, depending on how you define World War II. If one draws a graph of the number of people killed in major wars from early 19th century to the end of the 21st century, if there's a major war late 21st century, as I'm predicting, then the graph predicts that billions of people will die. Hence probably the greatest political challenge a global state of the time, that is late 21st century, will have to face will be the species dominance issue. What could such a state do to keep the peace between the cosmists and the Terrans? Personally, I just don't see any easy way out. There are many scenarios that one can dream up, but so far I have not found one that is both realistic and peaceful. Some people suggest that one solution is to make human beings themselves Artlex. That is the cyborg solution. A cyborg is a portmanteau word for cybernetic organism, that is part machine, part human. For example, by adding computer components to one's brain, etc. Cyborgs could add components step by step to their human bodies until they became Artlex themselves. The problem with this suggestion is that many people will be horrified at the idea of becoming cyborgs, especially towards the idea of having their children modified or cyborged, thus making them utterly alien, that is, non-human, relative to their human parents. I foresee the Terrans feeling the same kind of fear and revulsion against the cyborgs as towards the early Artlex. Since the Terrans will only have a few decades in which to react before they will be overtaken by the superior capacity of the cyborgs and the Artlex, the Terrans will need to undertake a first strike against the cosmists and cyborgs. If they leave it too late, their fate will be sealed. Their destiny will be decided by the cyborgs and the Artlex, who in time will become so vastly superior to them. The cosmists will be following very closely the arguments of the Terrans and be preparing for such a first strike. The cosmists will be no fools. They will include some of the smartest, richest and most visionary of the world's citizens, so they will obviously defend themselves. They will be ready. A global government will be fully conscious of these bitter arguments raging between the Terrans and the cosmists. The issue will split humanity right down the middle. It's my experience when giving talks to audiences on the cosmos-Terran dispute that when I ask my audience at the end of the talks to vote on whether they, as individuals, feel more cosmist or Terran about building Artlex, that the vote is always very close to a 50-50 split. Experience also tells me that most people feel deeply ambivalent about the Artlex issue. On the one hand, they see building Artlex as building gods, as something truly magnificent, something cosmic. On the other hand, they are horrified at the prospect of gigadeath, so also take the Terran point of view. This issue could cause a global civil war. I disagree with Fukuyama, who spoke of the end of history. By this he meant that the 19th and 20th century dichotomy between the capitalists and the communists has died, and that democratic capitalism has become the model that the whole planet is conforming to, thus ending history. Hence there will no longer be any divisive philosophical, political, ideological disagreement in the world. The world will be unified ideologically, Hence, history would come to an end, meaning that ideological dispute would come to an end. In the short-term future, say for the next few decades, it looks as though Fukuyama is right. The whole planet is democratizing, and even the Chinese government switched to capitalism in the late 1970s. No one believes in communist economics anymore. History has shown that the capitalist economic model is much more efficient at creating wealth than the communist economic model. Look at China and Japan, East and West Germany, North and South Korea, etc. A similar story is also happening with global democratization. A century ago, only a handful of nations were democracies. A century later, about 2/3 of the nation-states of the world are democracies. Probably in less than half a century into the future, there will be no more dictatorships left. Hence, Fukuyama's thesis appears to be sound. But he was not aware at the time he wrote his book, 1992, of the topic of species dominance. In the 1990s, only a handful of technical people were even conscious that the rise of the intellect would become the 21st century's biggest political problem, capable of causing a major war. So, assuming that the intellect issue is capable of causing a major war, what could a global state do about it? This chapter is concerned with the agenda of a global state, so let us place a possible intellect war on the agenda and ask what a global state could do, if anything, to avoid it. Civil wars, or wars in general, can take many decades to brew. Look at how long the US Civil War took to build up pressure, that is, nearly a century. Similarly, the global politicians will have plenty of time to become familiar with the viewpoints of the cosmists and the Terrans, and will be able to see a probable future conflict brewing, especially as the intellects get smarter year by year. Are there any measures that the global politicians could take to avoid an intellect war, that is, one between two human groups, that is, the Terrans versus the cosmists and cyborgs? I have not been able to find one, at least not one without terrible risk, that the Terrans could find acceptable. For example, it is possible that the intellects may ignore human beings and then leave the planet because there's such a huge universe to explore, with perhaps even more advanced intellects existing elsewhere in the universe. With such a scenario, there's no intellect war and human beings survive because the intellects have gone. But at what risk to the Terrans? What if the intellects before they leave the Earth find that human beings are a grossly inferior pest and get rid of us? The Terrans would simply not take the risk, I believe. The Terrans will probably prefer to take their chances by waging a war against the cosmists than hoping that the intellects will treat human beings well and not exterminate us. If the intellects choose to wipe out humanity, they could do it far more effectively than the cosmists could wipe out the Terrans. What about having cosmist colonies rocketed into deep space in space colonies to do their intellectual experiments at great distances from the Earth? The problem with this scenario is that as the colonies and their intellects could return to the Earth if they choose, from the point of view of the intellects, the Earth is a concentrated ball of raw materials and may be very valuable to them. If the intellects were in a highly advanced state, vastly superior to human beings, then they may not care about the welfare of humans. They may wipe us out and not give a damn, the way we swat mosquitoes or squash ants on a walk in the forest. In my intellect war book, I considered many possible scenarios, but none of them was very realistic, I felt. Therefore, I consider it likely that there will be an intellect war, and given the timing in which it will occur, that is late 21st century, and the level of passion it will rouse, the number of dead will be in the billions. I just don't see an easy way out. Humanity will therefore have to go through this misery, with the final result that the intellects come into being and start a new chapter in the history of evolution on this planet and beyond. I would not be at all surprised if this intellectual transition from biological species dominance to intellectual species dominance has occurred zillions of times in the universe. If so, then our example would be only one of a zillion. Nothing special, universally speaking, only special to us as human beings, since it is we who may be exterminated in the process of being superseded. So I do not envy the task of the global politicians as they attempt to tackle the species dominance issue. Frankly, I'm glad to be alive now. I will probably die peacefully in my bed in about 30 to 40 years from now, now being 2017. And when I wrote this, 2007 from now, and will not have to witness the horrors I am predicting will occur. whereas my grandchildren will see these horrors and will probably be destroyed by them. Since the world population is under 10 billion, and the prediction of an Artilect war is that billions will be killed, it's probable that my own grandchildren and most people's grandchildren will not survive it. So this section creates a rather gloomy contrast to the overall optimism generated by the creation of a global state. A global state could get rid of wars, get rid of poverty, ban the global arms trade, and could educate everyone. These are wonderful things and provide the main motivation for the writing of this book, but I try to be realistic rather than optimistic. I just don't see the global state stopping a global civil war in the form of the Artilect war. That's the end of chapter 9. The next chapter, chapter 10, is called Consequences of Globa.